Zero. This is the number that we need to aim for to stop global warming, according to Bill Gates' latest book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. We are currently at 51 billion. 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases are added to the atmosphere every year. We need to get the figure down to zero by 2050, or the global warming process will be irreversible and humanity is doomed. The climate is like a bathtub. It is slowly filling up with water. We can slow the flow of water to a trickle, but the tub will still eventually fill up and water will come spilling out onto the floor. We have no choice but to completely turn off the tap. That means we must not only reduce our emissions, but completely eliminate them. As the world population grows, the global demand for energy, especially in developing countries, will only go up. To be fair, there is nothing wrong with using more energy. But the trick is we have to deliver it without releasing any more greenhouse gases, so all that energy must be from renewable sources. In this book, Bill Gates talks about major human activities that contribute to global warming, and he also proposes solutions that are backed by sound scientific research. "97% of scientists agree that climate change is real, and it is caused by human activities that emit greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane are gases that are emitted from human activities, and they are responsible for trapping heat in the atmosphere, thus heating up our planet. There's already pretty much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere now. Our urgent goal is net zero emission, but in the future, we will need to go even further than that to achieve net negative emissions. That is, we need to even start removing some of the gases we have already emitted too. To return to the bathtub analogy, we won't just shut off the flow of water into the tub, we'll open up the drain and let water flow out too. This will not be an easy feat. Consider the COVID-19 pandemic. It almost shut the whole world down, claimed millions of lives, and put tens of millions out of work. Despite this, global greenhouse gases emission merely dropped 5%. This small decline in emissions is proof that we cannot get to zero emissions simply by flying and driving less. We need new innovations for fighting climate change. There are 5 major human activities that contribute to all global emissions: electricity generation, or how we plug in; manufacturing, or how we make things; agriculture, or how we grow things; transportation, or how we get around; and warming and refrigerating, or how we keep cool and stay warm. One important caveat to bear in mind is that we cannot entirely blame climate change for any particular event, but climate change does increase the odds of a heat wave happening. For example, warmer oceans are making storms wetter and increasing the number of intense ones. There's also a high possibility that these extreme events will interact with each other to produce even more serious effects. In every scenario, climate change is bad for us. A study shows that in the next decade or two, the economic damage caused by climate change will likely be as bad as having a COVID-sized pandemic every 10 years. A hotter climate means there will be more frequent and destructive wildfires because warm air absorbs moisture from plants and soil, leaving everything more prone to burning. The extra heat also melts polar ice, causing sea levels to go up and threatening the lives of 200 million people who will live below the sea level line. Our food supply will be adversely affected by climate change. Many crops are highly sensitive to heat, and extreme droughts could trigger a global food crisis, sending food prices up by 20% or more. Extra heat will make animals less productive and more prone to dying young, which in turn will make our food more expensive. More worryingly, a relatively sudden catastrophic climate change event could happen if large sections of the Earth's permafrost gets warm enough to melt and releases the huge amounts of greenhouse gases, mostly methane, that are trapped there. Fossil fuels are everywhere in our lives. The toothbrush we use every morning contains plastic, which is made from petroleum, a fossil fuel. The grains in our breakfast were grown with fertilizer, which releases greenhouse gases when it's made. The meat we eat every day is harvested from livestock, which emit greenhouse gases when we raise them. The vehicles we drive to work every day use petroleum as fuel. Our houses are made of cement, which is produced in a process that releases carbon as a byproduct. All our house appliances are powered by electricity, which is usually generated using fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are so inexpensive, as in oil is literally cheaper than a soft drink. Without some attractive incentives, it is very hard to convince people to transition away from fossil fuels. Furthermore, breakthroughs in sustainable technologies are hard to come by. A computer chip made today is roughly 1,000,000 times more powerful than one made in 1970. But we can't make our cars use 1,000,000 times less gas or make solar panels produce 1,000,000 times more energy. Moore's law simply does not apply to sustainable energy development. Big industries tend to resist change, and the energy industry is one of the biggest businesses on the planet at around $5 trillion a year. The inertia is really difficult to overcome. Large corporations will do what they can to defend the status quo, and smaller companies and consumers do not necessarily want to take the trouble to do the transition. Besides, people still fear nuclear energy, and high-profile accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima drove them even further away from it. The truth is, more people die from coal pollution in a single year than have died in all nuclear accidents combined. Companies and venture capital firms are reluctant to invest in green technology because the returns are so low or non-existent. For example, carbon that is captured using carbon capture and sequestration technology is not particularly highly sought after in the market, and they are usually being buried underground. There aren't exactly great ways to make money from it. Many environmental laws and regulations in place today were designed to solve other problems and are not suitable to be used to reduce emissions in the climate change scenario. Usually, implementing new laws and regulations is a nightmare. It takes a long time to develop a new policy, get public input, go through the court system if there's a legal challenge, and finally implement it. In many countries, politics are a huge obstacle. There are some small but vocal and politically powerful groups who oppose investing large amounts of money in fighting climate change. Some of them are climate change deniers who downright reject the notion of climate change. The rest are those who acknowledge climate change is happening but argue that we should prioritize other things like health and education. When it comes to renewable energy, the first thing that comes to mind is usually solar. Elon Musk is a big fan of solar. According to Elon, a 10,000 square mile solar farm in the desert could power the entire US. The second thing that comes to mind is wind energy. Together, solar and wind account for 7% of the world's electricity, and they are growing rapidly. However, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. Some parts of the world get abundant sunshine in certain seasons and some parts get plenty of wind. These seasonal and geographical variations are the reason why we cannot fully rely on only solar and wind. Instead, we will achieve optimal performance by building solar and wind in only the best locations, then ship this clean energy to wherever they are needed, which brings us to a very important aspect in achieving zero emissions: power grids. We rely on power grids to transport electricity from power plants to households, but our power grids are in urgent need of a major upgrade. Intermittency is a huge problem in our transition to all zero-carbon electricity. It's why cities that are trying to go green still supplement solar and wind with gas-fired power plants that can be powered up and down as needed to meet demand. The point is, we must install as much wind and solar power as we can, but we must also upgrade our power grids so that they can transport clean energy to regions where it is not economical to install solar and wind. Nuclear fission is a renewable energy source that is not discussed enough. It is in fact the only carbon-free energy source that can reliably deliver power day and night through every season, almost anywhere on Earth, that has been proven to work on a large scale. Of course, nuclear power has its own problems such as high costs, accidents caused by human errors, and radioactive waste. However, nuclear power is just too good for humanity to give up on. Instead of fearing it and stop advancing the field, we should get to work on solving these problems by analyzing the problems one by one and setting out to solve them with innovation. Nuclear fusion involves fusing atoms. Its fuel, hydrogen, is cheap and plentiful, and much safer compared to fuel for nuclear fission. It is also safer because there's no chain reaction to run out of control, as the fusion ceases as soon as you stop supplying fuel. In practice though, it takes so much energy to kick off the fusion reaction that you often end up putting more into the process than you get out of it. Offshore wind allows us to generate electricity much closer to the places where it will be used because so many major cities are near the coast. Offshore winds generally also blow more steadily, so intermittency is less of an issue too. This is a renewable energy source that holds a lot of promise. Hydrogen is a worthy mention. We could use electricity from a solar or wind farm to create hydrogen, store the hydrogen as compressed gas or in another form, and then put it in a fuel cell to generate electricity on demand. In effect, we would be using clean electricity to create a carbon-free fuel that could be stored for years and turned back into electricity at a moment's notice. In the manufacturing industry, we emit greenhouse gases when we use fossil fuels to generate the electricity that factories need to run their operations, when we use them to generate heat needed for different manufacturing processes, and when we actually make these materials. Steel, cement, and plastic are the building blocks of modern society. Unfortunately, we cannot manufacture them without emitting carbon dioxide. Making 1 ton of steel produces about 1.8 tons of carbon dioxide. Making a ton of cement produces a ton of carbon dioxide. Making a ton of plastic also produces a ton of carbon dioxide. These are dictated by chemical laws, and there's not much we can do here. We can, however, reduce emissions in other parts of the process. Essentially, we need to electrify every process possible, get that electricity from a power grid that's been decarbonized, use carbon capture to absorb the remaining emissions, and use materials more efficiently. As the world population grows and people get richer, they eat more calories. We need to produce much more food to feed the world, but we must do it in more sustainable ways. Around the world, there are roughly 1 billion cattle raised for beef and dairy. The methane they burp and fart out every year accounts for about 4% of all global emissions. By switching to artificial meat, we can cut down on meat eating while still enjoying the taste of meat. There are 2 kinds of artificial meat. The first kind is plant-based meat, which is plant products that have been processed in various ways to mimic the taste of meat. They use much less land and water and are responsible for fewer emissions. You also need less grain to produce them, reducing the pressure on food crops and the use of fertilizers too. The second kind of artificial meat is cell-based meat, which is meat that is grown in a lab. This isn't fake meat per se. Cell-based meat has all the same fat, muscles, and tendons as any animal. Scientists start with a few cells drawn from a living animal, let those cells multiply, and then coax them into forming all the tissues we are used to eating. All this can be done with little or no greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural activities are heavily dependent on fertilizers, which emit a lot of greenhouse gases in its manufacturing process and transportation process. What's even worse is that, after the fertilizer is applied to soil, much of the nitrogen that it contains never gets absorbed by the plant, but escapes into the air in the form of nitrous oxide, which has 265 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, there simply isn't a practical zero-carbon alternative for fertilizer right now. It is very difficult to capture the greenhouse gases that come from applying it. Deforestation is a huge problem that is plaguing the world right now. When trees are burned down, they quickly release all the carbon they contain. There's also damage that's harder to see. When a tree is taken out of the ground, the soil is disturbed and the stored carbon gets released. But deforestation is primarily a political and economic problem. People cut down trees not because they are evil. They do it because there are economic benefits to be reaped. What we need to do is we need to make sure rural communities have sufficient economic opportunities so they don't have to cut down the trees just to survive. A special mention is planting trees. Many environmentalists point at planting trees as the simplest and cheapest solution to climate change. Trees are certainly good for the environment, but for now, their effect on climate change appears to be overblown. On average, a tree can absorb 4 tons of carbon dioxide over the course of 40 years. However, if it burns down, all the carbon dioxide it was storing will be released into the atmosphere. Trees in snowy areas actually can cause more warming than cooling because they are darker than the snow, and ice beneath them and dark things absorb more heat than light things do. On the other hand, trees in tropical forests cause more cooling than warming because they release a lot of moisture, which becomes clouds, which reflect sunlight. The math suggests that 25 million square miles, or roughly half the land mass of the world, is needed to absorb the emissions produced by the United States alone. If we think we can solve climate change just by planting more trees alone, we are dead wrong. We need much more than that. Cars, SUVs, motorcycles, trucks and buses contribute the majority in this category. The rest are airplanes and cargo ships. Electric vehicles used to be far more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles, but the difference has come down dramatically in recent years. EV makers like Tesla and Rivian are now the most valuable automakers in the world, and traditional automakers like Mercedes and Volvo have all committed to transitioning to all electric in the next decade. Still, even if the whole world switches to EVs, they are still only as clean as the electricity that they use. For example, an EV that uses electricity generated by a coal-powered plant still contributes to climate change. We have no other choices but to do both. The switch from ICE vehicles to EVs and the switch from fossil fuel power generation to sustainable power generation. To speed up the transition to EVs, we need technological breakthroughs like advancement in battery technology and the installation of more charging stations. And we also need inventive government policies. China, India, and several countries in Europe have all announced goals to phase out fossil fuel vehicles over the coming decades. In a warmer climate, we will need to turn on our air conditioners more frequently. Ironically, it is the very thing that will make climate change worse. According to the IEA, the typical aircon unit sold today is only half as efficient as what's widely available and only a third as efficient as the best models. Governments need to create better energy policies to let consumers purchase the most energy-conscious models. This way, the world can double the average efficiency of aircon units and reduce the growth of energy demand for cooling by 45%. The solution is quite straightforward. First, electrify as much as we can, getting rid of gas-powered furnaces and water heaters and replacing them with electric heat pumps. Second, decarbonize the power grid by deploying today's clean sources where they make sense and investing in breakthroughs for generating, storing, and transmitting power. 3. Use energy more efficiently. To fight climate change, we need to work on technology, policy, and markets simultaneously. For example, simply adopting a zero-emissions standard for cars won't do much good if we don't have the technology to eliminate emissions, or if there aren't any companies willing to manufacture and sell cars that meet the standard. On the other hand, the invention of a new device that can capture carbon efficiently won't do much good if we don't create the financial incentive for power companies to install it. In a warming world, every single one of us is a stakeholder, and we are all in this together. This is 100 Tech, and I'll see you again next time.